why aren't you at COP26? Were you tempted at all to come over for that?
On one hand, I think it's great that so much attention is being placed on climate change. But if I'm being completely honest and potentially not diplomatic, I don't see much changing in the way of policy, in terms of subsidies, in terms of energy production, in terms of agriculture. So I worked with two organizations, Humane Society International and the Plant-Based Treaty, to create information around COP26, but I just didn't feel like my presence there was necessarily going to add anything. Very broadly speaking, as you know, the three leading causes of climate change are oil and gas, or petrol and gas production, coal production, and animal agriculture, or meat and dairy production. Like, those are the three main drivers. And also, as you know very well, you've written on this subject, we need to end those three industries.
Indeed. So let's pick up on the issue of animal agriculture, because there's really been very little talked about it at this big conference. We've heard a lot about coal power and all sorts of other stuff. I mean, coal power is disappearing largely here in its old-fashioned form anyway. But as you say, animal agriculture is a massive contributor. And yet nobody at COP26, precious few people, are talking about it.
Yeah, that's why I'm working with Humane Society International and the Plant-Based Treaty to try and draw attention to that. And it just makes me think of a conversation I had with Al Gore a while ago. And I was talking to Vice President Gore, and I was asking him why he didn't draw more attention to the role of animal agriculture in climate change. And he was so honest. And he said, basically, that meat and dairy production is the real inconvenient truth when it comes to climate change. It's because it touches family, it touches history, it touches tradition. People are so attached to traditional food, and it's very, as we know, it's very hard to ask people to consider traditional diets in an approach to climate change. Of course, we have to do that. There's no way to deal with climate change seriously and continue to produce meat and dairy, and especially not continuing to subsidize meat and dairy production. Like, that simply needs to end. And it's not necessarily as you know, it's not in the realm of opinion. Like, having opinions about meat and dairy production, we've moved past that. This is simple fact. It's the third leading cause of climate change, and it needs to be ended.
So here in the UK, about a week ago, our chief scientific officer said that everybody could do their bit by reducing the amount of meat they eat. Now, you wouldn't have thought that that was that controversial, but it caused a huge political backlash when he said it. And virtually the next day, our chancellor immediately did a round of interviews. He did that round of interviews from a meat market, and said that he wasn't telling anyone to eat less meat. He said literally those words, "I'm not telling anyone to eat less meat." I mean, what do you make of comments like that from our second most senior political leader?
Every politician knows that we can no longer produce meat and dairy and deal with climate change. But they also know that if they say that publicly, they'll lose their next election. So we end up in this horrible, paradox where people know the truth. The politicians know the truth. You cannot produce meat and dairy and effectively deal with climate change, but they won't say it because they're looking for political expediency, so they get reelected. But the problem is, it makes me think of and maybe this is going to sound a little bit dramatic, but I hope it isn't, is like, if I'm talking to someone who's smoking crack, I can't politely say to them like, "Oh, you don't need to stop smoking crack, just keep smoking crack and you're going to have a great, nice, long life." The only way you can save them is to say to them like, "Hey, you need to stop smoking crack." And that might be a very hard thing for that crack addict to hear, but it's the only truth that will save them. The same way as we know, we need to tell people very clearly, you cannot keep producing oil, gas, coal, and meat and dairy and expect to have a climate that will support human life within the next 100 years.
So do you think then politicians like Rishi Sunak, our Chancellor, should be brave enough to actually say, you know, you cannot keep the equivalent of smoking crack?
I mean, it's very hard for me because I'm not a politician, you know, I'm just a musician. It's very easy for me to say things without consequences. So I try not to be too judgmental. But when we look at the severity of the issue, you know, this is really in all of human history, this is the first time that there's an issue that affects every person on the planet, global south, global north, developing nations, first world nations, you know, it affects everyone. And if we don't deal with it, as you know, and I apologize for stating the obvious, if we don't deal with it, the earth will no longer support human life. And it's funny that that sounds so dramatic, like that sounds like the premise for a Tom Cruise science fiction movie, but sadly, tragically, it's the truth. So it's such an, you know, it's such an abdication of responsibility when a politician is unwilling to be honest about what they know.
Right, right. And you really invest in this whole issue, don't you? To the point that you have vegan for life tattooed on your neck. Can we see it? I can just about see it. There you go. That had to hurt, didn't it?
It hurt, but I mean, I've been an animal rights activist and a vegan for 34 years. But the tricky thing about being such a public vegan is a lot of people will then dismiss what I say about animal agriculture. And that's why I'd almost say, like, in a way, don't listen to me, listen to the scientists, listen to the climate scientists, most of whom are not vegan, but they're saying very clearly, you can't produce meat and dairy and have a sustainable climate. It's just a simple fact. Like, and it's hard because I kind of wish in a way that I didn't have a giant vegan tattoo on my neck, because that way someone watching right now wouldn't have an easy way to dismiss what I'm saying.
When did you get it done?
Well, I'm 56 years old now, and I got this done 2 years ago, right before the pandemic, because of course, there's no better time to get giant face and neck tattoos than when you're 54 years old.
And what about our Prime Minister Boris Johnson? What do you think of him?
I mean, I don't know. When he was first elected, people were sort of comparing him to Trump. And I felt like, and I'm not saying this that I'm pro Boris Johnson, but I feel like it was deeply unfair to compare him to Trump because, you know, I mean, Trump is like a dim-witted demon and Boris Johnson is just a goofy clown. So I feel like comparing a clown to the devil was a mistake.
Wow, well, I think Boris Johnson, I'm not sure he'll be entirely flattered by that, but he may take some comfort that he's not the devil.
He's not the devil, he's just a clown.
So just recapping finally then on COP26, do you fear that really because they've ignored or very much sidelined this absolutely pivotal issue, that ultimately it really won't have achieved much and it's just all been a bit of a talking shop, a bit of a junket for a lot of wealthy people?
Well, I mean, we look at past COPs, you know, like COP21, a lot was achieved, but there were no lasting consequences really. Most likely, unfortunately, sadly, COP26 will be like COP21, like a lot of talk, a lot of targets, a lot of great intentions. But the other thing to keep in mind, and I don't want to end on such a depressing note, but the other thing to keep in mind is without Russia, Brazil, India, and China, you know, it's really hard. Like if every European nation embraced COP26 and committed to their pledges and to their targets, it still doesn't involve Russia, India, China, and Brazil. And that means that like, until we involve every large methane and carbon producing country on the planet, until that happens, the problem will not be seriously addressed.